In this lecture, we'll be covering Chapter 13, The Arts in a Modern, Postmodern, and Pluralistic World, 1900 to present. Now, while this is pretty much the shortest time span that we are going to be looking at, this chapter is going to be a little bit different from some of the other chapters. If you notice at the beginning of the chapter, instead of having the different geographical sections like he's had in the other chapters, basically he breaks down modernism, postmodernism, and pluralism. And the reason this has happened and why he does this is because the perspective on the world has changed. Instead of seeing the world as these separate entities, we now live in a global time, and so we can rapidly talk to each other, communicate, and travel. So instead of seeing the world as these different geographical areas, we're now looking at a global community. Now, before you listen to this lecture, I want you to do two other things first. First, I have a PDF of a timeline on Blackboard. I'd recommend printing it out, maybe to have it as a reference. And I also put up a clip for The Shock of the New. The Shock of the New was a 1980 documentary television series written and presented by Robert Hughes, and it was produced by the BBC. And it was first broadcast by the BBC in 1980, and then in the United States on PBS in 1981. Now, I want you to watch this. It's actually, I think, an 8-part series. But I just have episode 1 up, and I only want you to watch about the first 10 minutes. Why? Because it does a nice little introduction of going into the new century, into the 1900s or the 20th century. And why I want you to pay attention to this is because what happens is we are now in a rapidly changing world. As we've seen before, most artworks have progressed from the artworks that came before it. Either they developed out of them, such as post-impressionism developed out of impressionism, or they developed as a reaction to it. For example, mannerism developed as kind of that hiccup after the Renaissance, or how after the Rococo we had the neoclassical. Well, what happens in the 20th and into the 21st century is we have this rapidly changing world. And again, I'm going to talk now as if you've already watched the first 10 minutes of The Shock of the New and you're looking at the timeline. So for now, reference the timeline. And what happens in this rapidly changing world, you can see this timeline. This is just basically 107 years, and I've just hit some of the highlights that is going on. So 1901, the first radio message is sent across the Atlantic. 1919 to 1918, World War I. World War I and World War II have very dramatic effects on the art world. We see this trauma within the world, and we see it reflected in the arts, okay? So back to the timeline, other things that are doing. 1913, quantum theory is applied to atomic structure. 1914, the Panama Canal opens. 10.5 million immigrants enter the United States. 1917, after World War I, we have the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Russia then becomes the Communist Soviet Union. 1922, Mussolini assumes power in Italy. 1927, the first motion picture with sound is released, The Jazz Singer. 1928, the first television broadcast, also the same year the discovery of penicillin. October 29th, 1929, it's the stock market crash, and it's the beginning of the Great Depression within the United States. 1933, Hitler comes to power in Germany. 1935, Mussolini invades Ethiopia. 1939, Germany invades Poland. World War II officially begins. December 7th, 1941, the bombing of Pearl Harbor in the United States officially enters World War II. 1942, Enrico Fermi splits the atom. 1944, DNA proved as fundamental in determining heredity. 1945, first atomic bomb is exploded in New Mexico. And then of the same year, on August 6th and August 9th, the first atomic bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This effectively ends World War II with the Empire of Japan's surrender. Germany had already surrendered May 8th of 1945. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union begins. 1946, the first computer is built. 1950, the first commercial color TV becomes available. 1954, your first McDonald's opens. It's also Brown versus Board of Education, where segregation becomes illegal in the United States. 1956, first transatlantic telephone service. 1961, first manned space flight. 1967, first human heart transplant. 1969, the first manned moon landing. 1975, the first personal computer is available for purchase. Think about that. Think of how many computers you have on you right now. Obviously, you have at least one because you're listening to this lecture. But most of us carry around smartphones. These are mini computers. Those became available 41 years ago. 1977, Star Wars is released. 1980, Pac-Man video game released. 1984, Apple Macintosh computer first marketed. 86, the Chernobyl nuclear accident. 1990, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Germany becomes reunited after the Warsaw Compact of World War II. 1991, we have the collapse of the Soviet Union. 1996, Dolly, the cloned sheep, is born in Scotland. 2001, the first generation iPod released. And so these are just some of the highlights from this timeline. But you can see how the world is changing and changing quickly. Within 100 years, we go from having very few cars to having, cars that are produced everywhere, that most people have a car. Families usually have more than a car. Think about how, 150 years ago, if you wanted to travel to Europe, how long would take you? Probably over a month. For most of us, how long would it take us? We could be in Europe by tonight. And so we have this rapidly changing world. Also, the effects of World War I and World War II are very, very profound because man now has the power to literally destroy the world. And we see this after World War II. And that's the atomic bomb. I mean, we're in the nuclear age now. And because of all this, what we're going to see in the art world is the art world, instead of falling on that linear path we've been on, it actually shatters. And so we're going to see within modernism, we're going to see all these different styles that develop, and in a way they're all trying to deal with this rapidly changing world. So first we'll talk about modernism. This is about the late 1800s till around World War II. After World War II, it's a little bit of a squishy date. What happens in modernism? It develops as a rejection of romanticism and realism. The main phrase you need to know for modernism is make it new. Modernism is a rejection of traditional conventions and forms. Innovation and experimentation are celebrated. The world at this time is seen in a constant flux with no coherence, and the art reflected this chaos and this idea of the unknown. Modernism denied the authority of the past, this idea that the peak of Western civilization was in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Modernism denies that and says, no, that's not true. That's not happened yet, this peak of man, that this man's potential is actually unlimited. Then we'll move into postmodernism. That's about, again, 1945 to arguably the current day. Now, postmodernism grows out of modernism. And what we'll see, and we'll again talk about this more in the second part of the lecture, but modernism questions this idea of a grand narrative. And that's what we're going to see within modernism. These artistic styles that are offering some sort of answer, or trying to, or some way of dealing with the world. A grand narrative is the idea that all human existence can be described and understood in a single theory. Communism, Freudian psychology, and so on. Well, postmodernism says no, there is no one complete, unified, final narrative. There are a variety of perspectives, and they all have some value. Postmodernism also shows how society is fractured and still not fully knowledgeable of everything in the world. In postmodernism, what ends up happening is that instead of looking at different artistic styles, again offering these grand narratives, what we're going to see is we're going to see experimentation continue, but we're going to see new types of artwork that are developed, such as feminist art, installation art, and we'll talk about those in the postmodernism section. And then the third section is pluralism. Now, at the end of the chapter, he has a section on pluralism. I actually don't have you reading that. We're just going to focus on pluralism here. And what pluralism is, it's actually a vague concept, but for our use, it applies to ethnically related activities and their acceptance and inclusion as art with value. And so what happens is we're going to see a focus on egalitarianism and not ethnocentrism. What ethnocentrism is, it's the idea of judging other cultures from the belief that one is superior and correct. And up until this point, in the Western world was the idea that the Western world, and especially, Greece and Rome, that was the highest part of art. The Renaissance, right? That was great artworks. And that any other works of art from that time period are then judged against them and often found lacking. And that's kind of the example I have for you here. So what you see is a ceramic of the underwater panther from the Mississippian culture, 1400 to 1600. It was found in the Rose Mound in Cross County, Arkansas. The other is Raphael's Alba Madonna, again from the same time period. Well, what happens in ethnocentrism is it would take these two works of art and it would compare them and judge them. And so the idea would be, well, the Alba Madonna is obviously the better art because we can see the skill and the technique in it compared to the ceramic underwater panther. Well, what's going to happen, though, with pluralism is we're going to see this shift to egalitarianism. Now, egalitarianism is the belief that all people are equal and should have equal opportunities. And what this does is this focuses a new emphasis on the art of ethnic minorities. So we take these same two pieces where where ethnocentrism, we're judging one against the other. Egalitarianism says, no, we should not be judging these against each other. For each of the cultures that they represent, number one, they represent the culture, and they have value for that culture. So they should be each looked at individually as artistic pieces of value. Also, during the time of pluralism, we're going to see the rise of cultural relativism. This is beliefs, customs, and other expressions of cultures must be understood and judged within their own context, rather than from outside viewpoints. So when we look at the ceramic of the underwater panther, we need to look at it within the context of its own culture. So we always need to be aware of this. We need to be aware of how we are looking and judging at something. Now we have to remember, we always bring our own cultural influence into the mix, right? We're humans, we have baggage, but we need to be aware of it. And that's what we're going to see discussed within pluralism. That's what pluralism focuses on. The value of all art, not judging art against each other. All right, so now we're going to move on to the modernism section. And this is how I would prepare for this. In the other lectures, I've given you a slide with the artistic styles I want you to know. Well, within modernism, there's like 8 bajillion different artistic styles. So this is how you should approach this section. If I were you, I would know the basic tenets of each of the different styles. So Expressionism, know what the main idea is and what the artists were trying to get across. However, if I were you, what I would do is I would pick one piece of, or one modernistic style, again, within modernism, and not minimalism, as you can't pick minimalism, and I would know everything about it. When it was founded, where it was founded, who founded it, know some specific artists and artwork, and be able to discuss that. So if, say, somebody would ask you an essay question saying pick one modernistic artistic style and explain all parts of it, including a specific artwork and artist, you would be able to do so. There's your big giant hint. Okay, so what we're going to do for the rest of this section, the modernism section, is we are going to talk about some of these different artistic styles. Again, this is meant to supplement your reading. And remember, that main phrase of modernism is to make it new. So we're going to see a rejection of many forms of the past. All right, well, the first artistic style we're going to look at is Expressionism. Expressionism is different from abstract expressionism. Please do not confuse them. Expressionism started in Germany in 1905 with Der Brücke, which is the bridge. Ernst Kitchener and Emil Nodel were were a few of the pioneers in this program. And what happens in Expressionism is the artist consciously is trying to stimulate in the viewer a specific response. So what happens is the viewer, as you're looking at this, so the work on the left, we see Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night. And the idea behind this is that you as the viewer, as you are looking at this, you are supposed to experience the same emotions that he was feeling as he painted the work. Later works, we're going to see on the left, earlier works still have some representational quality in it. We can see in Van Gogh's The Starry Night, a town, the night sky, but later works become almost completely abstract and non-objective. And you can see that in the work on the right. This is Vasily Kandinsky's Schwarze Linen or Black Lines from 1913, and it's an oil on canvas. Now, what Kandinsky thought was through color and line alone, works of art could express the feelings and the motions of the artist directly to the viewer. He believed his own works to be equal to music and that they were alive and non-figurative. Each line for him and each color carried explicit, expressive meaning. So he thought paintings like this had the power to lead us away from the outer to the inner basis. And he wrote in 1911 in his book concerning the spiritual and art about color. And he says, color is able to attain what is most universal, yet at the same time most elusive in nature. Its inner force. And so for him, color had specific meaning. So blue, he considered the heavenly color, yellow, the color of earth, and then green, a mixture of the two, is passive and static, yet can represent the self-satisfied, fat, and healthy. Red stimulates and excites the heart, and red and green, which are complementary colors, juxtapose the passive and the active, and their harmony is very charming. And he claimed his work showed the simplicity and pastoral harmony of an idealized peasant life. Now, much of Expressionism was an outcry against materialism, urbanization, and industrialization. The works often had some sort of apocalyptic scenes to them and looked at the destruction of civilization. Theater within Expressionism. Scenic design allowed playwrights a means to express their feelings again of the outer world around them. And you see this an example in the American Elmer Rice's The Adding Machine of 1923. And what happens in this is that it's kind of talking about, just the hopelessness of man's existence and how man himself is going to be replaced. So what happens in it? The story focuses on Mr. Zero, who is an accountant at a large, faceless company. Well, after 25 years at his job, he discovers that he'll be replaced by an adding machine. So in anger and pain, he snaps, he kills his boss. Mr. Zero is then tried for murder, he's found guilty, and hanged. He wakes up in a heaven-like setting known as the Elysian Fields. There, Mr. Zero then begins to operate an adding machine until Lieutenant Charles, the boss of the Elysian Fields, comes to tell him he is a waste of space and his soul is going to be sent back to Earth to be reused. The play ends with Zero following an attractive girl named Hope, who may not actually exist off stage. So the idea is that Mr. Zero means nothing, right? In his life, he was replaced by a machine. And then even in the afterlife, he was replaced, that his soul is not worth anything. And he's basically sent down and recycled. And this, again, is supposed to express the author's view of the world at the time. In film and Expressionism, in Germany, they tried to convey this through the decor and the subjective mental state of the protagonist. Sets were usually very purposefully artificial and meant to show a state of mind and not be representational. And you can see that in the YouTube clip I have for you here. This is Robert Vine's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1919. And you can just watch a couple minutes of this. Pay attention to the sets, the scenery. Again, it's supposed to express that mental state. What happens in this is there's a madman in an asylum, and he's trying to explain to a mad woman how he got there. Okay? Expressionism, the movement died out because many outsiders saw the works as unapproachable. And in Germany, once the Nazi Party came to power, they saw expressionistic works as degenerate art, and they eventually outlawed them. Now, another example of expressionism that we've already looked at this semester is Edvard Munch's The Scream. All right, moving on to Fauvism. Fauvism, in 1905, the term was actually coined by a critic that claimed a sculpture looked like a Donatello in a cage of wild beasts. And what you see in Fauvism often, especially in the painting, is this violent distortion of color and this very outrageous use of color. One critic said of their artwork, "One feels completely in the realm of abstraction." Of course, as in the most extreme departures of Van Gogh, something still remains of the original feeling of nature. But here, one finds above all in the work of Matisse the sense of painting in itself, the act of pure painting. And so Henri Matisse is probably the most well-known of the Fauvist artists. His date's 1869 to 1954, and he was French. Now, what he tried to do is he tried to paint pictures that would unravel the tensions of modern existence. He saw line and color as individuals, and he tried again to express his feelings as objects as aesthetic interest. Now, he wasn't trying to get the viewer to experience his own feelings like Expressionism, but he was trying to, with this violent distortion of color, just kind of deal with the tensions of the world. The painting on the slide here is The Green Stripe, also known as Madame Matisse. It was actually Matisse's wife, from 1905, and it's an oil and tempera on canvas. Now you can see it plays with complementary colors within it, and we've got this odd distortion or use of colors within the works. The movement itself was actually short-lived, and it really only lasted till about 1908. All right, next we're going to move on to probably one of the most well-known movements of modernism, and that's Cubism. Cubism was about 1901 to 1912. And what we're going to see here is the work on the left you've seen before. This is the work of Cézanne, the post-impressionist artist. And if you remember in the lecture, I said he's considered the founder of modern art. As remember, what he wanted to do was he wanted to break down the works into their most basic geometric shapes. Well, this influenced Pablo Picasso, 1881 to 1973, and Picasso is often considered one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. Now, what is so important with Cubism is Cubism changes the way space is dealt with in an artwork. And what happens is instead of just depicting or breaking down the subject matters into their most basic shape, little cubes, the shapes actually become part of the space they occupy themselves. So if we were to remove any part of the space or any part of the artwork, it would fall, it would collapse. And so the term Cubism was actually come about in a review by Louis Vauhaus of Baroque's work, who we'll see a Baroque in a moment. And he stated, Baroque reduces everything, places and figures and houses, to geometric schemes, little cubes. Now again, they tried to paint not just the objects, but the spaces they engender. So cubists represent a three-dimensional world in two-dimensional terms. The object becomes part of the space around it. If the object is removed, the painting fails. Within Cubism, we're going to see simplified color and restricted forms, and they often played with the reality of painting, and this echoes the reality of the world. Cubism freed painting of the necessity to represent the world. And literally, it's giving us a new way of seeing the world. And the painting you're looking at here on the right is Pablo Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, 1907, oil on canvas. This is actually in the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, in New York City. Now, what you see here, subdued colors, simplified forms, and no one viewpoint. This is a clear break with classical form and proportions. The painting was modified many times. They know this because we see early sketches. It shows there were actually originally two men in the work, a sailor seated in the middle, and a medical student that was entering from the left holding back the curtain. Now we see one of the women is holding back the curtain. And they've actually x-rayed this painting, and the x-rays show the painting itself went under many revisions. The figure on the left and the two on the right have many different layers of paint. And there's speculation that he actually changed the faces of these three. They almost look like masks. And there's speculation that there was an exhibit in Paris at the time where Picasso was, an exhibition of African masks. And they think Picasso went to it, maybe was strongly influenced by it, and that's why he changed the three women's faces so they almost look like these African masks. Also, pay attention, we have a double point of view here. It appears we're looking straight on, but look at the two women in the center. When we look at their faces, it looks as if we're looking straight at them, but look at their noses. They're actually in profile, so we can see this double point of view. Again, the space that they're in also becomes part of the objects themselves. So if we tried to, say, remove the central figure, it wouldn't just be like removing a vase from an artwork. The central figure is actually also taking up the space. The space and her are one and the same. Now, the name of this also is a little tongue-in-cheek. It's the Les Demoiselles of Avignon, right, which would mean the ladies of Avignon. Well, Avignon is the French city for a while, which was a home of the popes. And the ladies, right, these women are not ladies. These are actually prostitutes. And Avignon is not referring to Avignon, the city of the popes in France, but actually a street which would have basically whorehouses in it. All right, both of these works are also done by very well-known Cubist artist Georges Braque, 1882 to 1963. He was influenced by both Picasso and Cézanne. On the left is the houses at El Escouade, 1908, oil on canvas. And here you can see we're looking at a simple landscape, right? We're looking at the houses and the trees. But here you can see very clearly he's broken it down to those simple geometric shapes. And then if you look at the trees, the tree in the foreground actually blend into the greenery between the houses and the roof of the house near the top. The houses themselves actually begin to blend into one another. And we see here the collection of cubes and triangles as much as a landscape. The other work is Violin and Palette from 1909, and it is an oil on canvas. Now, if you look in here, we can see in the left foreground a violin, there's sheet music, and then up near the top is an artist or a painter's palette. Now, when you look at this, look at how the objects, again, are broken down and almost take up the space or also put in the space that they occupy. If you look at the violin in the sheet music, the violin is actually just as flat as the sheet music it is. Now again, if we tried to take any section of this out, the objects are part of the space they are in, and again, it would fail. All right, next we're going to look at Futurism and Mechanicism, and we're going to look at them at the same time. We'll start with Futurism. The term Futurism actually comes from Filippo Marinetti's, he was an Italian poet, his manifesto, La Figaro, which was published in a French newspaper, and in this manifesto, he called for a new art, which he called Futurism. Now, first, we should talk about what is a manifesto. We've heard of the Communist Manifesto. Well, within a manifesto, basically it's kind of an instruction guide of how to live life. And the idea is that within Futurism this is how the world should be lived. This is the correct way to do it. So what happens in Futurism is that it champions aggressive action, a feverish insomnia, the racer stride, the punch and slapped. Marinetti claimed he had discovered, quote, a new beauty, the beauty of speed, a racing car whose hood is adorned with great pipes, like serpents of explosive breath, is more beautiful than the victory of Samarith, which I've pictured in the lower right. He claimed futurism should destroy the museums, libraries, and academies and sing of the multicolored, polyphonic tides of revolution in the modern capitals. So what happens in futurism? It is a celebration of the future. And what is the future? The future is in the machine. They saw beauty in the factories and the industries that were developing. Cars, all of this. The faster you could go, that was the future. Forget the past. And in fact, futurism says destroy the past. Get rid of the libraries, get rid of the museums, get rid of the academy. That doesn't matter anymore. It's gone. What is the future? The future is speed. Within sculpture, new materials, and there was a search for new forms being used. And what happens is, you can see here in the image on the right, this is Umberto Bocchini's Unique Forms of Continuity in Space from 1913. It was cast in 1931 as a bronze. Now, your book claims that it shows Mercury, the messenger of gods, and the book claims this, Spore claims this, because on the feet of the figure, they almost seem to be winged feet. Now here, I'm going to completely disagree with the book, because Mercury is a god of the past. Futurism is a rejection of the past. And so what I think this is celebrating more is, again, we see within this sculpture, right, this piece that does not move, we see a sense of movement in it, that this humanist form, the human almost becomes a machine, and we see it striding forward. Also, you can see this in the painting here, right, this idea of movement, and something just as simple as taking a dog for a walk. This we can see in Giacomo Bella's Dionysm of a Dog on a Leash, 1912, oil on canvas. And again, it's a simple movement. Somebody's walking their dog, but what's the focus? The focus is on the speed. I mean, look at the little dog's legs, like he's trucking along. The tail's moving. If you look, you can see the leash is moving back and forth. The person who's walking, we see this sense of speed. And that's what futurism called for. Futurism called for a celebration of the machine and of speed. Forget, destroy the past. Literature in futurism also called for a rejection of the traditional, and it called for a new technique in the writing of poetry. Also, futurism rejected logical sentence construction and rules of grammar. Now, don't try to do this in your paper, say, well, there's grammatic errors, but I was embracing futurism. It's not going to work. Words in futurism literature were often strung together for sound alone. The movement of futurism lasted a little bit until about the 1930s, and then it just kind of faded out. Now, mechanicism is related to futurism. This developed in the early 20th century, and it sought to express the spirit of the age, again, by capturing speed and power through representations of vehicles and machines in motion. However, what makes mechanism different from futurism is it did not call for a destroying of the past. It said the past is there, it's fine, we don't need to destroy it, but we need to move on. And how do we move on? Through the celebration of the machine. All right. Now, this piece is more of a transitional piece. This, what's going to happen from 1914 to 1917, we're going to have World War I occurs. This is the First World War. It was called the Great War because the idea was that after this war, right, this global conflict was so horrible, the idea was that it would never happen again. If you recall from your history of World War I, it was long and horrible fighting. This was where we had trench warfare, where literally along the fronts, both sides would be dug into these deep trenches, and the soldiers would just be stuck there. If you tried to get out, you had snipers waiting to pick you off. This caused for a long, horrible war. We see the use of different gases, mustard gas being used on people. And this is a horrible, horrible way to die. And so what happens after World War I is we're going to see in a lot of works this sense of disillusionment within humanity itself. Now again, this work I've said is more of a transitional piece. This is Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase. And here we see some of the ideas of mechanicism, right? That we have a figure walking down the stairs, yet the figure is broken down into some of these geometric shapes, kind of like cubism, but it almost looks more machine-like, like Futurism or Mechanicism. Now, Duchamp is going to become very important, and we've talked about him a little bit at the beginning of the semester. And we're going to see him in this artistic style. This is what's called Dada, or Dadaism. Now, Dada is the French word for hobby horse, but most people claim that the Dadaists claim this name because they just want it to be nonsensical. What happens is Dadaism develops after World War I, and it emerged as an illustration of the disillusionment from World War I. Dadaism took up Futurism's call for annihilation of tradition, but it doesn't have this sense of hope for the future, where Futurism looks to the future as, speed, the machine. Dadaism is nihilistic. It says, what does it matter? There is no point. There is no meaning. Again, Dadaist artists basically celebrated nonsense without any meaning. However, the movement was somewhat of a political protest of the time. Dadaists celebrate irrationality, meaninglessness, and harsh mechanical images. They champion senselessness, noise, and the illogic. Dada was against art or art in traditional forms. Now, what happens within Dadaism is this idea that the artwork, the object itself, is not important. What's important is what the artist goes through. And Dadaists believe the arts must shock, and its goals are to insult and outrage. And Marcel Duchamp was Dada's chief master, if you will, and you see this in a lot of his ready-mades. The ready-mades are where he took some sort of object that was already made, and he does something to it. You can see this with the image on the right. This is his LHOQ from 1919, and what it is, it's a postcard of the Mona Lisa. What does he do? He puts a mustache and a goatee on it with pencil. Then he renamed it LHOQ. Now, when you say this quickly, it actually translates into French. Your book says she's hot in the pants, but basically it means she's got a nice ass. And he's doing this to the Mona Lisa, right? One of the iconic artworks. And he's doing it because, again, he's saying it's not the artwork itself, it's the message and the meaning, that the message and the meaning that the artist goes through. And we see this very famously in the 1917 fountain. Now again, what happens, that fountain is a urinal. He painted Armut 1917 on the side of it, and then he put it in to be an art show. He put it in because art shows you would submit works, and ones would be either accepted and shown or rejected. So he submitted this under Armut, and it was rejected. They said, no, we're not going to show this. Well, what happens, Duchamp at that time is already a very famous artist. Well, it gets revealed that Armut is actually Duchamp. So what happens? Yes, of course, they want this work within the exhibit. And basically Duchamp says, thank you for proving my point. The object itself never changed. What changed was the artist, the process that the art went through. All right, the next artistic style is abstraction. Now this has two different forms. The first is the reproduction of images from forms to shapes that represent actual objects, which is on the right, or the pure use of color, line, shadow, mass, and other formal elements to make an object refer only to itself. Abstraction seeks to explore the expressive qualities of formal design elements and materials for their own rights. So you see on the image on the left, this is Georgia O'Keeffe's Dark Abstraction of 1924. It is an oil on canvas. And so what happens when you look at this, what O'Keeffe often did in her paintings was she would go so close to an object, especially in her flower paintings, that it would be the painting of the object itself, but since it was so close, it almost became these abstract forms. So what happens in this painting of Dark Abstraction, the artist has taken her subject from nature and simplified it into a design of color, shape, and line. It almost looks like this could be some sort of landscape, but we really don't even know from it. Now, the other work, this is the idea of where we abstract the most essential elements that are needed to understand a work. And this one on the right is Corrosis from 1944 to 45, and it's made of pink Georgian marble. And it was done by Isamu Noguchi. Now, this is actually the base is slate, and then again, I think I've already said it's pink Georgian marble. It's 9 feet 9 inches tall, and what he's doing here is this is actually a representation of the human figure. But what he's done is he's only abstracted what he considers the most essential elements that you need to understand the work. All right, next is Surrealism. Surrealism also developed as a reaction to World War I, but it was more hopeful than Dada. This was developed by André Breton, who wrote the Surrealist Manifesto in 1924. Now, what he claimed the Surrealists sought to do was to reunite the conscious and the unconscious realms of existence. They wanted to do this because they believed once the conscious world and the unconscious world became one world, right? The idea is that they would become so fully intertwined that the world and dream of fantasy would join the everyday rational world. And through this joining would be the absolute reality, which is called surreality. And that's where we get surrealism. Surrealists thought their works were created by pure psychic automatism, meaning that you don't even really think about what you're creating. It's just somehow the image is what it becomes onto the canvas, if you will. Surrealist painters wanted to merge reason and unreason, and they wanted to discover the basic realities of psychic life by automatic associations. And so what we're going to see within Surrealism is we're going to see a lot of experimentation. A lot of these artists were very interesting, led very interesting lives, and they play around. I mean, they would take hallucinogenic drugs, all of this to try to uncover that unconscious mind. The artists were very interested in the works of Sigmund Freud and his work on the subconscious or the unconscious. Now, Surrealist works manifest themselves in two ways. The first you can see on these works on the slide. The first way is they contain some sort of recognizable forms, fantastical often, but we can recognize some of the subject matter. You can see this, the image on the left. This is Salvador Dali's The Persistence of Memory, 1931. It is an oil on canvas. Now, Dali claimed that the work was basically a hand-painted dream photograph, that he would have dreams, and when he would wake up, because dreams is under Freud's philosophy, dreams are one way that our unconscious or our suppressed desires manifest themselves. And so for Dali, he would just paint these dreams. He wouldn't know what they meant. In fact, if you asked about, the melting clocks, the ants, the weird landscape, for him, he says, I don't know. This is just what was in my dream, and so that's why I painted it. Now, interestingly enough, in this one, he does say that it is somewhat of a self-portrait. And so the large slug-like figure is actually a self-portrait of Dali as he saw himself in the dream. Now the other example, the image on the right, this is Girigo de Chiro's Melancholy and Mystery of a Street, 1914, also an oil on canvas. Now, de Chiric claimed he did not even understand his own paintings. He said these were simply images that obsessed him, and he had to get them on canvas. He said they conveyed anxiety. So when we look at this, we kind of want to make a story. For him, there was no story, no meaning. These were just things that were in his mind, and he had to get them down on the canvas. So for us, we want to look at it and be like, okay, we see the little girl playing in the foreground, yet we see the sinister shadow in the back, the open wagon, and we want to tell some kind of story. We think he's depicting this, but for him, he would say no. These were just images that were in his mind that he had to get down on canvas. Now, the second way that the Surrealists would show this artwork, is works that were almost fully abstract. And these works present an indecipherable visual riddles. An example of this is Joan Miro's painting 1933. And when Miro created, he would try to get to that automation, just to that point where he wasn't even thinking about what was being created. It was just the images that came out onto the paper themselves. And it would almost he would try to do this to get the idea of the unconscious coming to the conscious world. All right, well, next we're going to look at minimalism. Remember, if there's an essay, you can't pick this one, but minimalism develops around the late 1950s into the 1960s. And what happens in minimalism is it sought to reduce the complexity of both design and content as far as possible. Minimalists wanted the simplest and fewest elements used. It was non-sensual, impersonal, geographic shapes and forms that address space and how the viewer relates to them spatially. There is no message from artist to viewer. The goal of minimalism was to leave response and meaning entirely up to the viewer. And you can see that in the works here. On the left, you have Donald Judd's Untitled. Again, most of his works were untitled because to put a title on something is to give it meaning. This is 1969, and it is copper. Now, the work on the right is by Frank Stella, Empress of India, 1965, and it's metallic powder and polymer emulsion on a shaped canvas. Now, this is a very large work. It's actually 6 feet 5 inches by 18 feet 18 inches. And Stella kind of puts the ideas of minimalism in this quote. He says, "My painting is based on the fact that only what can be seen is there. It is really an object. All I want anyone to get out of my paintings, and all I ever get out of them, is the fact that you can see the whole idea without confusion. What you see is what you get." Okay? So minimalism purposely creates an artwork with no narrative. All right, next we're going to look at absurdism. Absurdism reflects the search for meaning in the time period, and what happens for the absurdists is as they look for meaning, they only find chaos, complexity, and possible insanity. Absurdism asks the question, what is real, and finds dismay in a world that offers no answers. Basically, this meaninglessness is reflected in the written plays of the time. Jean-Paul Sartre, who is a French existentialist, wrote at this time, and he said the individual is a free agent and can determine their own fate. He said that life held no absolute or universal moral values, and these only existed through humankind, that there are no morals within the world. And then the 2 clips I have for you here. The first is Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. And what happens in this play? It's kind of a play about nothing. You have 2 characters, Vladimir and Estragon, and they are waiting on the side of the road for someone named Godot. Godot never shows up, and we get the idea that these characters have been waiting there for a long time. So basically, they try to divert themselves or distract themselves while they're waiting. They don't even actually, we discover they don't actually even know Godot. They only know him by reputation. And they try to do different things to occupy their time. They philosophize, they sleep, they argue, they sing, they exercise, they swap hats, they even consider suicide. Basically anything to hold the terrible silence at bay. And so it's kind of about this hopelessness. We get the idea they've been there for a long time, and the play ends how it begins. They're still just on the side of the road waiting for Godot. So please play the first YouTube clip. You don't have to watch all of it, but listen to it and kind of get an idea of this kind of hopelessness, this meaninglessness in the works. Now the second clip is for your enjoyment. It's actually from Sesame Street, Monsterpiece Theater, and they kind of do a little parody of Waiting for Godot, and they create Waiting for Elmo. All right, next we're going to move into realism. This section you can kind of skim. We skipped the chapter on cinema, so what you're going to see here is within realism is basically it's going to be realism within cinematography. So this section gives a brief history of film. We have the Vitascope that is created on April 23rd, 1896, Thomas Arndt. This captured real objects in motion and then printed them on the screen. The Lumiere brothers, first public projection of movies on a large screen, 1895, and they called these the cinematographics. And they called these brief films actualities. They were kind of little documentaries. And you're going to see that. What I've done here is I've given you kind of little clips so you can see the Lumiere brothers. We have a sequence shot that develops. Sequence shot is a complete complex action photographed in continuous take without cuts. George Millet, French, and then the American Edward S. Potter showed the narrative and manipulative power of film. Millet's pioneered what's called cutting into continuity, and Porter developed what's called splicing together new and old film shots. So before, we'd have this continuous shot. So to change scenes, what would happen, and you can see this in the Millet clip here, is that when we change scenes, we would fade to black and fade back into a different area. Well, what happens with Porter is he literally would cut the film and then splice it back together. And so you would have, you see this in the Great Train Robbery, you'll have different points of view without having to do this fading. In 1940, The Grapes of Wrath took on social criticism within film. And then we're going to see film as it develops become more and more creative through cinematography. Example were 1941's films How Green Was My Valley and Citizen Kane. What happens in films is it creates a new type of realism. It's the idea that it shows the real world, yet in a way that can be manipulated. I mean, and think about how far film has gone, right? With CGI, we can have dinosaurs running around. So please take a minute, look at some of the clips on here. The Lumiere film is from 1895. It's Man with Hose. Millet's is A Trip to the Moon, 1902. It's considered the first science fiction film. The Porter is The Great Train Robbery of 1903. The Edison is kind of fun. It's Uncle Josh at a moving picture show, 1902. And what he actually did is he actually filmed many people's first reaction to film. And then the last clip is what's considered the first horror film. This is the Battleship Potemkin, 1925. And here you have the Odessa Staircase Massacre. And this was considered very gory, very graphic for its time period. All right, well now we're going to move to abstract expressionism, 1945 to about 1960. Now what happens in this, it began in New York, and New York at this time had become if not the, cultural artistic center of the world. Now what this time period is this is right after World War II. Unlike after World War I, where we had this sense of disillusionment and hopelessness, there was a window of time after World War II where there actually was an increase in optimism for the future. We have all these GIs coming back home. We have the GI Bill. This is when we have the baby boom, right? The husbands come back home. Husbands and wives do what they do. We have all these babies. There was funding, so people were able to buy homes. We see explosions in the suburbs. And so there was this kind of increase in optimism for the future. However, by the 1960s, the Cold War, the arms race is in full force, and we see the rise of the nuclear age, and abstract expressionism fades out. Now, abstract expressionism as an art form is a little different to characterize because they're all so vastly different. However, there are two main characteristics that remain constant throughout the abstract expressionists. Remember, abstract expressionism and expressionism are not the same thing. So these two main characters that remain consistent is number one, freedom from traditional use of brushwork, and second, the exclusion of representational subject matter. These works are to be completely abstract, and the goal was to show the expressive capabilities of their own individual gestures and styles. Probably the most famous of the abstract expressionists is Jackson Pollock, 1912 to 1956. On the slide on the top here, you see number 29, 1950. This was created in 1950. It's oil, expanded steel, string, glass, and pebbles on glass. Now, the reason why this is on glass is because there was a filmmaker, last name is Namath. And what he did is he wanted to come in and capture Pollock painting. So Hans Namath had him actually create this work on glass, and he was filming from underneath. And that's one of the clips here, the second clip. You can actually watch Pollock painting this. Now, Pollock is what's called action painting. This draws the viewer into the action of the painting, but it also refers to the active paint handling by the artist. You can almost chart the artist's movement within the work. And what happens is the method was spilling and dripping paint onto large canvases that were placed on the floor. Pollock would take these canvases and he would place them on the floor because he would almost kind of dance around them. He said he wanted them on the floor also so he could literally become a part of the painting itself. And he says when he's painting, he becomes unaware of what he was doing. So this is a quote from Pollock. "When I am in my painting, I'm not aware of what I am doing. The painting has a life of its own. I try to let it come through. It is only when I lose contact with the painting that the result is a mess. Otherwise, there is pure harmony, an easy give and take, and the painting comes out well." And so what Hans Namath did was he created a series of photographs and then 2 short films. One was in black and white and the other was in color. That's the one from under the canvas. And Namath said of Pollock's painting, he says, "Pollock's method of painting suggests a moving picture, the dance around the canvas, the continuous movement, the drama." And so the 2 clips here, the second one is the film, and then the other one is just kind of a short little 5-minute where you actually get to hear Pollock talk, you get to watch him paint. And it's very interesting to see him do it because he kind of dances around the canvas itself. Now, Pollock actually died at a young age. He died at 44. Pollock actually was an alcoholic, and he was in a single-car accident. It was alcohol-related, and he was driving. All right, 2 other abstract expressionist artists. On the left, we have William de Kooning, 1904 to 1997. And what we see in de Kooning's work is we see this visible application of paint to the surface. His works were hashed out, scribbled over, and very loosely gestural. This is called Woman on Bicycle, 1952 to 53, and it's an oil on canvas. Now here you see somewhat of representational. However, he said his images of women were not meant to be degrading to women, but just to show his freedom from traditional representation of the form. De Kooning liked the instability of art, and he says, "I do not think of art as a situation of comfort." Now, the image on the right is from Mark Rothko, 1903 to 1970. What he was known for were these very large canvases and what we call these color field or color block paintings. And it looks very simplistic. We look at this canvas and it's a large field of color. Yet what happens is it's carefully modulated fields of color that tend to bleed together. The color suggests the luminous space and the light. And now what Rothko wanted is he wanted people to feel emotions when they look at the work. And now I have to say personally, like when I first saw these, I was like, I don't get it, right? It's just paint on canvas. I can do it. First off, try it. It's actually really hard to do. And there's something distinctly different about seeing a Rothko in person. They almost seem to glow from the canvas. And Rothko stated about his own work, "I am interested only in expressing the basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on. And the fact that lots of people break down and cry when confronted with my pictures shows that I communicate with those basic human emotions. The people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them." All right, well, what we're going to see in the 1950s and the 1960s, we're going to see another explosion in art forms or art styles. These are still going to be considered modernism because they have specific messages and meanings. That's going to include pop art, hard edge, primary structures, minimal art, post-minimal art, environmental, ephemeral art, body art, earth art, video art, kinetic art, photorealism, and conceptualism. The next section, we're just going to focus on a couple of these. All right, next we're going to look at pop art. This developed in about the 1960s. The book says the 50s, but a little 60s there. The leaders of this movement were Andy Warhol, Klaus Oldenburg, and Roy Lichtenstein. And the work you see here is a work by Roy Lichtenstein. Now, what happens with pop art is the images were actually a commentary on American consumerism at the time. You have to think about in this time, things are being mass produced, and things are being produced very cheaply, and so the United States is in a consumerism culture that people just want to go and buy. Pop art represents life as Americans lived it. And it also shows that American culture played a very powerful role in our emotional lives. One goal of pop art was to transform the everyday into the monumental. The artists also turned away from traditional painting and used more current tools in their works. Some of these images were created by machines. And because of this, pop art almost got this negative connotation to it, that it was cheap. But the pop artists were saying, why would we not use the tools of the time to create artworks that are easily reproduced and more cheaply made so more people can have them? That's the entire point of consumerism. So this actually gave many artworks a commercialized feeling, which is code for calling it cheap. Here we see Roy Lichtenstein's Wham from 1963. It's magna on 2 canvas panels that are each 5 feet 8 inches by 13 feet 4 inches. Now what he would use is he would use what's called the Ben-Day screen dots. What happens with these place color ink on cheap newsprint. The Ben-Day dots, if you think about old comics and newspapers, if you look at them, they're actually not solid color forms. They're these little dots. But the human eye naturally tends to fill in the space. And the reason newspapers did this is they were able to save so much money on the ink. Well, Lichtenstein is using that in the printing of his works, and often his works have these comic book influence to them. And he does this because he's looking at how the comic books are actually reflective of the time, looking at it for some of the subject matter, and then also it's looking at some of kind of the absurdness. He would often have works that would show romantic turmoils between men and women, and such a degree it's kind of nonsensical. In fact, there's one scene where a woman's car has gone off a bridge and she's upset at her lover, and she said she'd rather drown than to call Brad. All right, probably the most famous of the artists, of the pop artists, is Andy Warhol. And what we see here, Andy Warhol would often create or recreate images from everyday consumer culture. Here we see his Campbell soup cans from 1962. This is synthetic polymer paint on canvas. Now what happens in these, the reason why there's 32 canvases is because Campbell Soup at that time, their slogan is 32 varieties of soup. Now he's kind of making this comment on consumer culture, saying, do we really need 32 different kinds of soup? And here, interestingly enough, this is located also in MoMA, and I thought it was kind of funny. It's actually on the wall outside of the cafe. But also what Warhol was doing is he was challenging, again, this idea that art can't be cheaply produced. If it's cheaply produced, then it's not high art. And he challenged that. He was basically saying, well, why not? And in fact, he actually called his studio the factory, because they would just churn out different works. All right, well, looking at architecture within modernism, again, what happens is we're going to see urban centers that need to be built up. And so we're going to see the development of the skyscraper. A lot of this we cover in the architecture chapter. Louis Sullivan, who is considered the first truly modern architect, coined the idea of form follows function. He said, it is evident that we are looking at a department store. Its purpose is clearly set forth in its general aspect, and the form follows the function in a simple, straightforward way. In the 1920s, in Germany, we have the development of the Bauhaus School in Weimar, Germany, and this was founded by Walter Gropius, who was an architect. In architecture, how the Bauhaus approached it is they approached aesthetics from an engineering point of view. Therefore, they said you didn't need these outside decorative elements. They were removed. And so what happens in Bauhaus ideology was actually a combination of arts and craft. The goal of the Bauhaus, it was a school, was to train students in both theory and practice of arts. And they also wanted to make the artists and designers more socially responsible. The Bauhaus strove to coordinate all creative effort to achieve, in a new architecture, the unification of all training in art and design. The ultimate, if distant, goal of the Bauhaus is the collective work of art, the building, in which no barriers exist between the structural and the direct decorative elements. And you can see that here. This is an example of the Bauhaus design, and this is called the House on Horn. Basically, it means the house on Horn. That was the street it was built on. And so what this is a prototype of cheap, mass-produced construction using the latest materials. It has a steel frame with concrete infill. The center was a large room surrounded by rooms for every need. And then within each room, the Bauhaus also supplied everything you needed for it. And so you can see here, you can see the floor plan on the lower right, the building on the left, and then the upper right you see the kitchen. And so everything is designed to be aesthetically pleasing, yet to be functional. Okay? You can even see on the left we have the different ceramics that are created by the Bauhaus students, and each of them has its own specific purpose. Each room has its own definite character, which suits its purpose, and in each room, function is the most important thing. The aim of the house was to achieve the greatest comfort with the greatest economy by the application of the best craftsmanship and the best distribution of space in form, size, and articulation. Now, the Bauhaus actually had to move to Dessau due to the political pressures, and eventually the Bauhaus had to close its doors altogether because it was condemned by the Nazi Party. It was seen as un-German and therefore deviant and Jewish, and many of the artists had to flee. Many traveled to the United States, and one of the Bauhaus teachers, Moholy Nagy, moved to Chicago and actually opened the new Bauhaus in 1944, which later became the Chicago Institute of Design and then became part of the Illinois Institute of Technology. All right, another important modernist architect was Frank Lloyd Wright, 1867 to 1959, and he develops what's called the Prairie style, developed around 1900, and this was inspired from the flat Midwest landscape. We've already talked about Frank Lloyd Wright a little bit in our architecture chapter, but remember he emphasized commingling the interior and the exterior of a home. He believed a home influenced those who lived in it, and he claimed the architect was actually the molder of humanity. He would even design the furniture and the decorations for the home. Now what you see here, this is the Roby House, the Frederick C. Roby House. It is in Chicago, and it's actually now a U.S. Historic Landmark. And this is in the Chicago Hyde Park neighborhood. You can go in and see this today. And it was designed and built between 1908 and 1910, and it's renowned as probably one of the greatest examples of his Prairie School style. Right? Also during this time period, we're going to see the rise of the skyscraper. This we'll see after World War II. Louis Miles van der Rohe was one of the famous architects, and what he was known for, I believe your book has the Seagram's building, these large glass and steel boxes. And what these were, we built upwards, and we got rid of any ornamentation and decoration because they were seen as completely not necessary. All right. Music within modernism. Music also sought to remake the genre, and some did it very radically, while others were more subtle. In the radical, there were three main changes. First, complex changing rhythms were used, in some cases making it almost impossible to determine meter or even a beat. The use of dissonance was often used, and often this was used to to disturb the normal. And then three, rejection of tonality and key. Again, in music, the idea is to make it new. So we're going to see these forms of the classic and all that. It's thrown out the window. It's completely rejected. Now, there were some more subtle approaches. These took on more of a neoclassical approach and did not depart too much from classical music. And so here you've got some different examples. Paul Hindemith, who was German, he favored experimentation and department from tonality. And then Arnold Schoenberg, between 1905 to 1912, he turned to post-romantic works, and he began alternating timbre swiftly and fragmenting rhythm and melody. He eliminated repetition, and his pieces became much shorter. And so you can hear these within the works. Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. This caused a riot actually when it was first performed. It was challenging the idea of traditional ballet, and this we'll talk about more in the dance chapter. All right. And then modernism and dance. Again, this will cover more in depth in the dance chapter, but the same thing. The idea is to make it new. They sought to remake the genre and challenge classical norms. So when we see modern dance, usually it's much freer, it's much lower to the ground, often performed barefoot. And again, it's challenging those traditional ideas. Modernist literature also sought to remake the genre and break from traditional forms. Fictional writers sought to illustrate the disorder in the world, often had characters that rose to honor and dignity in a very dishonorable world. D.H. Lawrence is writing at this time. Ernest Hemingway also writing, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and his works were often influences by his own experiences in time of war. William Faulkner, 1897 to 1962, wrote in Stream of Consciousness and embraced Southern novel, As I Lay Dying, The Sound and the Fury, and Absol Amsel. All right, well, that's going to be the end of the modernism section. Again, I know it's a lot, but know the basic tenets of each of the different styles. But if I were you, again, I would pick one, not minimalism, and pretty much know everything about it, including specific artwork and artist. In this section, we will now start covering postmodernism. Again, to review from the beginning of the lecture, postmodernism develops out of modernism. Again, the idea is still to make it new, to explore, to create, to challenge traditional ways. But what happens in postmodernism is that, again, it's a rejection of the grand narrative. What happened, what we saw in modernism, is we saw, again, the art world shattered, and we saw all these different artistic styles develop that tried in some way to deal with the world, either explain the meaninglessness to it or to try to deal with the horrors of World War I or World War II. Well, what happens in postmodernism is the idea develops that there is no one single theory that can describe all of human existence, that there are a variety of perspectives and that they all have some value. Again, society is fractured and knowing everything is impossible. And so postmodernism is the aesthetic term that refers to the variety of art forms that develop. What happens is they try to break down the distinctions between high art and popular culture. We're going to see things such as performance art develop. More so than modernism, postmodernism also reflected the knowledge that the human race could be the ultimate cause of their own destruction. This is a time period sometimes called nihilistic time, meaning that it's a philosophical doctrine suggestion that basically there's meaninglessness to life, that everything has no value, any intrinsic moral value is actually just placed there by human being. It explains a general mood of despair at the perceived pointlessness of existence. And so what we're going to see in modernism, again, instead of looking at specific styles of art, different isms, if you will, what we're going to look at is new techniques or new art forms that develop. So the first is what we call installation art. Installation art are works that take up sometimes entire rooms, sometimes large parks. And what happens with installation art is it's actually challenging the idea that art must be restrained within certain boundaries. Also, it challenges how space is lived in and utilized. Example, if you've ever been to the 21C Museum in downtown Louisville, I believe it's still there. but there's a room that's almost completely full of like dryer lint. And again, that's that installation, is that's supposed to challenge how and why we see and use space. Another art form that develops is digital art. Digital art uses some sort of electronic media, and it allows for a collaboration between the viewer and the work. An example from the textbook is Michael Liu's Office Voodoo. Digital art usually combines a variety of genres, from visual art, music, film, photography, performance art, and so on. This became more popular as contemporary society became more involved with technology. Phones, laptops, iPads, iPods, and so on. In fact, there are actually some museums where there are iPads or tablets attached to the wall, and that's how you go and you view the art digitally. It's not a painting on a canvas, but it's something created on an electronic media. Digital artists often see themselves somewhere between artist and researcher, and often studying the human condition. Now, an example of this is what I have on the screen here. This is Text Rain, and it's also at 21C. This was created in 1999, and what happens, it was created by Camille Utterback and Romy Artuve. And Text Rain is actually an interactive installation in which participants use the familiar instruments of their body to do what seems magical. They literally lift and play with the falling letters that don't exist. And you can see here, we see the backs of the two individuals, yet they're projected on the screen. What you can't see here is the text is literally raining down on them, and so they can catch them in their hands. So please play this YouTube clip, which actually gives you a little 5-minute explanation, and you actually get to see the digital art. This is still in 21C. It's actually back by the bathrooms, I believe. So if you're ever there, go check this out. Another style of art that develops around 1970s with second wave feminism is feminist art. First wave feminism was earlier in the century when women fought for their rights to vote, the 19th Amendment in 1920. Well, what happens is that women have been largely ignored in the art world, and more women are beginning to achieve increased recognition within the art world. And so what feminist art begins to do is it pushes for the viewpoint of women artists. And feminist art, again, it's not just art by women, please don't think that, but it's art kind of celebrating the history of women. And probably one of the greatest examples of this is Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. At this time period, feminist art is also beginning to be recognized in the academic world. So what happens with Judy Chicago's Dinner Party? You can see it pictured here, 1974 to 79. Each side is 48 feet, and it's actually at the Brooklyn Museum of Art now. So what happened over 5 years, Chicago and over 400 other people helped create this work. And what they were doing is basically she was stating for much of human history, the acknowledgments and contributions of women have largely been ignored. And so what she decided to do is basically she decided that if she was going to throw a dinner party in celebration of the women throughout history who have been largely overlooked. And so what she does is she creates this. Number one, she wanted it to be a dinner party because traditionally women would have been the people who would have cooked the food, yet they would not have been invited to the party itself. And what she does is she creates this equilateral triangle, and there's 13 seats on each side. Now, the reason why she picked 13 seats, so there's a total of 39 settings, was she thought it was very interesting that at the Last Supper, there were 13 people participating in it. And so she thought, that's a good number. However, what's also interesting, so 13 is seen as the number for male holiness. Well, there's actually 13 witches in a coven. And she thought it was quite interesting that the same number that represents male holiness represents evil and women. Now, this is set up in chronological order. So the dinner table itself, equilateral triangle, it starts with the beginning of time to the end of the classical period, then the beginning of Christianity to the Reformation, which Chicago actually deems as the lowest point in the lives of women. And then the third side is the American Revolution to the present. And in fact, the last two place settings are Georgia O'Keeffe and Virginia Woolf. Now, how she decided on who could be in there were four main criteria. First, the woman's contributions or circumstances had to render her representative of a particular time period. Second, the woman's life needed to embody some type of significant achievement. Third, in some ways, this achievement had to work for the betterment of women's conditions. And finally, Chicago and her workers had to have enough information on the woman to visually make an image. Unfortunately, there are many women that they wanted to be a part of this project, but they had to omit them because they just could not find enough research about them. Okay, so what happens is when you go in to view the dinner party, you actually have this entry, which is a transitional space. There are 6 banners that were created by the artists on looms. And what happens is that as you walk through the space, there's actually a poem on it that is written by Chicago. And it's to help you transition, that you're going from our known world into a world that's acknowledging and celebrating the contributions of women. Now again, she's not saying that history needs to be rewritten, that what written is wrong, but that history for the large part has only been told from one point of view. So she's trying to tell another point of view. All right, well, each of the place settings has a runner, which is done in needlework, and then it contains a plate. So the runner actually contains, is supposed to represent the woman's time period, and then the plate itself is to represent the imagery of the women. And the idea that why there are plates on the runners was to show the idea that the women had been consumed rather than honored by history. The plates themselves are 14 inches, which makes them much larger than a regular dinner plate. And she did this on purpose because she wanted people to realize this just wasn't any dinner party. Each place setting also then has a napkin, a fork, a knife, a spoon, and a cup. So the plates themselves were actually created using a China painting technique, and the reason she chose this technique is because it was a time where women would get together and they would create these plates, this pottery, in a group setting. And it was also a tradition that was passed down, usually from mother to daughter. So this was a time when women would come together and they would share. Now here, I have 3 different examples of the plates. As the plates start out, they're pretty flat, but as you go more and more through time, they start to rise up from the table. And in fact, you can see the Margaret Sanger piece. It actually looks like she's trying to push herself out of her time period. And this is just 3 examples I'm giving you here. The first is Theodora. Theodora helped to rule the Byzantine Empire with her husband Justinian. However, before her marriage, she was an actress. This is a position that made her despised by many because women were not allowed to be actresses at that time period. In fact, they would be looked at almost as a prostitute. Well, after she was crowned with Justinian, she actually worked to establish many laws that improved the position of women, including instating the death penalty for rape. After the Emperor Justinian died, she actually ruled the empire and continued to fight to improve the lives of women. Now, her plate reflects the mosaics at the Ravenna Cathedral she and Justinian had built, in both the mosaic design and the colors that are used. Now, it took Chicago and her workers months to develop this plate because they couldn't quite get it right. They couldn't get the mosaic right. So what happened is they actually discovered by actually cutting the mosaic design into the plate and then repeatedly firing it with glaze and glaze and glaze, the plate appeared that it was actually made of individual tiles. And it's not. This is just one solid plate. The middle image is the plate of Emily Dickinson, 1830 to 1886. Dickinson felt her intensive creativity was at odds with the prevailing ideas of women were supposed to be in the Victorian time period. In fact, she wrote over almost 1,800 poems in her life, but they weren't discovered until after her death. She didn't try to publish any of them because she knew her society would reject the work she made, and so that's why she never attempted to share them. Chicago says this plate is made of this lace to show a creative genius imprisoned in the lace, yet she's also celebrated for having the courage to create her works. And the last plate is Margaret Sanger's. She was an American woman who fought for the sexual and reproductive rights for women. She asserted that without reproductive rights of their own bodies, all other rights were meaningless. In fact, she was the founder of the International Birth Control Congress, which was the forerunner of today's Planned Parenthood. The resistance she faced is represented in her plate. The bright red color of the plate is to proclaim women's bodies as their own. And the image on the plate, unlike any of the other plates, it actually seems to be kind of reaching around the edge of the plate and attempting to lift itself off the table. And so what this is again, it's kind of showing her culture, her rejection of her own culture. All right, so the runners each plate sits on, again, depicts a different design for each woman. The runners represent a metaphor for each woman and the environment in which she was living. Now, the reason why Chicago chose needlework to show this is because traditionally needlework has been the work of women. The only time throughout history where men have overtaken needlework is when it became profitable. And so for this, we are looking at the runner for Mary Wollstonecraft, 1759 to 1797. Now, for Chicago, she claims that this was actually one of the hardest runners she had to do. Yet, she felt she had to show this event. Now, the needlework in this one is what's called stump work. And so you can see on the right hand, you can see that there's little pieces of cloth and clothing. And that's what was used here. You would use little scraps and you would reuse them in the work. The stump work isn't really worried about proportion and size. It's just using the spaces that are available to you. Now you can see in the stitching, you see the name Mary Wollstonecraft kind of cut off at the bottom. Each woman's name is on hers. Then on the opposite side, this is what made this so hard for Chicago, is she decided that she needed to show this event within Mary Wollstonecraft's life. Mary Wollstonecraft was a writer in the Enlightenment, and she wrote a vindication for the rights of women, where she argued that women should have the same educational rights as men. There was a prevailing idea that men were smarter, and basically she said, well, if you don't educate women, you can't expect them to be able to basically compete on the same level as men. But if women had the same educational rights as men, we would see that they were equal. Now, what's interesting with Mary Wollstonecraft is she actually died because of complications from childbirth. And that's what you see here. You actually see her laying in the blood-soaked birth bed. Her husband's to the right holding the baby. Now, the baby that he's holding is Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, otherwise known as Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. But Mary Wollstonecraft died because of complications from childbirth. And Chicago felt it was very important to show this because for so long it was deemed a woman's duty to have a child. Yet it's largely ignored about how destructive actual childbirth is to a woman's body. And so she felt that she needed to tell this within this runner. All right, now the entire dinner party actually sits on what's called the heritage floor. And what this is a tiled floor, 2,400 tiles, and on it there's hand-painted names in gold. There are actually 999 other women's names. She picked that number because she just said it sounded like a good number. And what she wanted to do is, so the dinner party is contained on this floor, and she knew the 39 women weren't enough, so in some way she wanted to get more women in them. And so what's interesting is the names are all somehow linked together. So under Mary Wollstonecraft's place setting, the name directly under hers is Mary Shelley's. All right, well, after its initial show, the dinner party was scheduled to be shown in 2 other museums, but they both canceled. Now, the original dinner party had over 100,000 visitors, but it sparked a lot of controversy. And so what happened is all these people kept canceling. And so what Chicago had wanted to do was she wanted to, again, add women's voices to history, not to rewrite it, but to celebrate the contributions women had made. And her ultimate goal was to find a permanent home for the work to be displayed. And she felt that if it didn't get this home and was just put back into basically, cases and stored, the whole point would be lost. Because her point was exactly that women have not been represented. Well, luckily enough, what ends up happening is that the dinner party did find a permanent home in the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art in the Brooklyn Museum. The center is wholly dedicated to raise awareness of feminism's cultural contributions and to educate new generations about the meaning of feminist art and to present feminism in an approachable and relevant way. So if you're interested in this artwork, it's a wonderful artwork. The Brooklyn Museum has a wonderful website on it. You can actually click on each individual plate, each individual runner, and get a lot of details. And then Judy Chicago also publishes a lot of books. So there are many texts that you can go and find about this particular work of art. Also, there is a smaller dinner party that has been a replica, and it actually still travels the country today. All right, the next art form we're going to look at is performance art. In performance art, the art itself is literally that. It is a performance. It is presented to an audience. Traditionally, it's very interdisciplinary. Sometimes the performance may either be scripted or unscripted. It could be random or very carefully orchestrated. It could be spontaneous or carefully planned, and then with or without audience participation. But at some point, it has to be performed to an audience. The performance can be live or via the media. The performer can be present or it can be absent. Basically, it can be any situation that involves four basic elements: time, space, the performer's body or presence in a medium, and a relationship between the performer and the audience. Now, performance art can happen anywhere, in any venue or setting for any length of time. The actions of an individual or a group at a particular place and a particular time constitute the work. So what we're going to see here is we're going to see literally the performance happening. And this can happen in a variety of ways. The term usually refers to something more conceptual or conceptual art, which conveys a content-based meaning in a more drama-related sense, rather than being simply a performance for its own sake or entertainment purposes. And the examples I'm going to show you here are Maria Abramovich. What happened from May 14th to May 31st, 2010 in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, she had an exhibit which was called The Artist is Present. This was 736 hours and 30 minutes long. And what happens is she sat immobile in the museum's atrium while spectators were invited to take turns sitting opposite for her. And so what she does is basically she sits at a table in a chair and looks down. Somebody else comes and sits down and she looks up at them. They don't talk. It's just they sit there and they look into each other's eyes. And people have a variety of experiences. And the idea behind this, right, it's the idea that, by just sitting there and looking at somebody in the eyes, you can get this completely different experience. And so what you have here is from this, you actually have a film, it was on HBO, of The Artist is Present. The Artist is Present. It's a documentary from it. One of the clips here I have for you is just kind of the preview for the film, so you get a generalized idea of the performance. And then the other clip, interestingly enough, she was, Maria Abramovich, has been doing performance art since about the 1970s, 60s, 70s, and she used to have a partner named Yule, and they used to perform together, and they actually had a romantic relationship. But they had had a falling out and actually hadn't seen each other for 23 years. And so the second clip is where he actually comes to the museum. Now, she had seen him earlier in that day, but this is the moment she didn't know he was going to sit down at the exhibit. And so the second clip is the moment where he sits down. And this is the only time in the 736 and a half hours that she actually broke her facial expression. So please watch both clips. Again, they're not very long, but it gives you an idea of this performance art. All right, well, postmodernism architecture is actually a rejection of modernism's steel and glass box. What we're going to see in postmodernism is this idea of exploring the idea that form must follow function no longer controls. What we're going to see here is that experimentation is going to be celebrated. And postmodernists wanted to create buildings to include culture and the environment. They were a repudiation of the glass and steel box of the Seagram's building. And we see that in works such as this one. This is by Frank Gehry's. This is the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. Now, we already saw a different work of Gehry's in the architecture lecture. That was a Walt Disney Concert Hall. Is that architecture? Yeah, that was a form follows function. So again, here what we see with Frank Gehry, this building, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, it's actually built as part of the environment. It's based right along the water of this port town. And so the building itself is supposed to represent the waves of the water. The buildings within postmodernism actually become almost more sculptures than buildings themselves. All right, postmodernist music continues along some of the same ideas as modernist music. It rejects the traditional forms of high Western art, and this goes to about the 1960s to the present day. Now, postmodern music, your book breaks it down and says there's mainly a focus on four main forms. The first is minimalism, which developed around the mid-1960s, and this was a reaction against the radical modernist music and embraced clear tonality, a steady beat, and repetition of short melodic patterns. Composers also wanted their music to reach a wider audience. An example of this is Philip Glass's Strung Out from 1967. Second, we have experimentation, and it's exactly what it sounds like, experimenting with music. Some choose to work with microtones, which are intervals smaller than a half step. Others have added theatrical elements to their work. An example of this is Robert Moran's 1937 composition for a piano with a pianist. And I tried to find a video of this and I cannot, but what happens? This is what the score reads. A pianist comes onto the stage and goes directly to the grand concert piano. He climbs into the piano and sits on the strings. The piano plays him. All right, the third is improvisation, and this is where composers allow the performer to improvise part of the piece. This is very reminiscent of jazz. In 1990s, the music form actually became musique actuelle, and it exudes vibrancy, a liveliness, and personal expression. And almost always it has some sort of humorous element to it. And then the last form is what's called sound liberation, basically freeing the sound. And this is where new techniques are used to produce new sounds from conventional instruments. An example is Penderec's 1933 Polymorphia. Here I've given you the clip for it. It doesn't actually start till 1:45, but what happens in this, it's using traditional instruments but using them in a new way to produce a new sound. All right, then finally, postmodernist literature. What happens here is it's the belief that language cannot reveal truths about the world, but that it does have persuasive powers. Many movements arose in postmodernism, challenging some of the modernist practices. And so here's just a couple examples of some postmodernist literature. What you're seeing here is called concrete poetry. Now, this is poetry that has a strong visual element. You have to physically be able to see it to understand it. So what happens in concrete poetry is the poet's intent is conveyed through graphic patterns of letters and words and symbols. Again, the works must be seen to be understood. Another idea that developed is what's called magical realism. This was largely a Latin American movement, and what happens, it incorporates fantastic or mythical elements into otherwise realistic fiction. For example, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude from 1967. Here, this tells the story of 7 generations of the Bodina family. But what happens is after a dream, the patriarch decides to find a utopian city. And basically, he invents an entire new world. But the rest of the story is telling the history of the family. And then finally, another development in literature in the postmodern era is what's called confessional poetry. Now, this centers on autobiographical materials. They do not have to be true, and usually, though, they reveal the details of one's life. Themes of death, alienation, pain, and self-destruction are often portrayed in this. This was a very powerful tool for women writers because this was one of the first times that their voices and experiences were accepted as a valuable form of literature. Example of this would be the poetry of Sylvia Plath. Okay, well that concludes the lecture on postmodernism.